scruff themselves a little bit in trying to limit their attention to a number of different things in the environment and really go from task A to task B in a really dedicated way. Short lists benefit certain people. I know a lot of people are list makers out there. They like to put 2 or 3 things or maybe 20 things that they're going to accomplish each day. One of the best tools that I ever learned, both for sake of task switching, but also for sake of just getting things done on a consistent basis, I picked up while I was a master's student at Berkeley. A very accomplished professor at that time told me that he writes down every day 3 things that he's going to accomplish, and only 3 things, never more than 3. Now, he also included other activities. In fact, he was quite active in his physical life. So he rode his bike to campus. He also was a runner. He also went to the gym. He did not include those on his list of 3 things, but he would write down no more than 3 critical things to do each day. So he had 3 critical tasks. So I've employed that method as well. I'll write down 1, sometimes 2, most often 3, but if I can, just 1 or 2 tasks that I need to complete each day. And everything else is considered part of the, let's just say, automaticity function of my day. Things that I already know how to do that don't require a ton of cognitive focus, but I limit the things that require a lot of cognitive focus to 3 things per day. However, those 3 things per day can take up many, many hours each, and certainly on the whole. Okay, now there are additional things that one can do to improve your ability to task switch. And one of the things that I found particularly beneficial is not a meditation, but rather is a perceptual exercise. And this is a perceptual exercise that I learned about when I was a graduate student, but in a totally different context. And it has to do with the way that your visual system and the parts of your brain that parse time are related to one another and influence one another. Now, the reason this tool makes sense for improving your ability to task switch is because it turns out that where you focus your visual attention strongly influences the way that your brain parses time. So I'll describe the tool first, and then I'll get a little bit into the underlying mechanisms. But again, I'll get deep into the underlying mechanisms as well as the tool, as well as additional tools in a future episode about task switching on the Huberman Lab podcast. So if you were to, for instance, close your eyes and not look at anything in your external environment, and just concentrate, for instance, on your breathing or the feeling on the surface of your skin. I know this is starting to sound like meditation, but trust me, it's not meditation. Your perception of time, that is how finely you are slicing time, would be distinctly different than if you were to open your eyes and focus on a faraway location, say way off in the horizon, and not focus on your bodily sensations. Similarly, if you were to focus your attention on some intermediate location, maybe, let's say 20 feet away, and simultaneously focus on your internal bodily sensations or the surface of your skin, your perception of time, how quickly time was passing, would also be different than if you closed your eyes or if you were looking at some distant location. So the perceptual tool for task switching is a very simple one, and it's one that, frankly, I do every morning and have for many years now, and at least for me, has really enhanced my ability to task switch. And that is to just take a couple of minutes, and this really only takes about 2 or 3 minutes. And typically what I will do is I'll start by closing my eyes. Oh, I should mention I typically do this in an environment where ideally I can see off into the distance, perhaps from a balcony, from an apartment or a house, ideally outdoors. But if I'm indoors, I'll still do this. I'll just look as far off into the distance as I can when that step is required. But I start off by closing my eyes and essentially not looking at anything, but directing my brain's focus to either the surface of my body, just what it feels like, what it's in contact with or not in contact with, maybe my breathing. Then I'll open my eyes and I will focus on some location on my body, but my bodily surface, like my hand at some distance. And I'll focus my attention there, maybe for just 5 to 15 seconds. I should mention that the first station, as I call them, where my eyes were closed and I was focusing on my bodily sensations, I also just do that for about 5 to 15 seconds. And I don't count specifically, just roughly 5 to 15 seconds. Okay, so second station, you're looking at the surface of your hand. And if you like, you can also concentrate on your breathing. But typically people will just focus on some specific location on their hand. Then I'll typically lower my hand, then I'll look off into the distance, maybe 5 to 10 feet, doesn't really matter. Focus my visual attention there, try and hold that focus for 5 to 15 seconds. Then I'll look further off in the distance, maybe further still off into the distance. Ultimately, what I try and do is look at a location as far off into the distance, as I possibly can. And I'm also trying to pay attention to my breathing at the same time, just as a way of calibrating my location to the location that I'm looking at and how great that is. Then typically I'll close my eyes and return my attention to my immediate environment and my breathing just in the location I'm in. Okay, so the entire thing only takes about 2 minutes. Again, starting with eyes closed, focusing on self, 5 to 15 seconds, then eyes open, focusing on surface of one's body. That is focusing one's visual attention, 5 to 15 seconds, maybe 10 feet away, then maybe 50 feet away. If you're in the metric system, okay, meters, folks, works just as well. These distances do not have to be precise. And then off to the horizon, and then back to one's immediate location by closing one's eyes. Now, what is happening when one does this perceptual exercise? And again, it's a perceptual exercise. It's a visual perceptual exercise. Well, what's happening is you are shifting your visual focus, obviously, but you're also shifting the way in which you fine slice or thick slice time. Now, your ability to recognize consciously whether or not you're thin slicing or thick slicing time is much harder to get a grasp of than it is to get a grasp of whether or not you're looking at your hand or off in the distance. That's kind of obvious. But what we know for sure is that as you shift your attention from your immediate environment out to different designated locations in your environment and your time perception shifts accordingly, you're essentially training your brain to shift visual focus and the way in which you process in the time domain. And this is important in the context of task switching because so much of task switching is not just to understand, okay, I'm going from reading to running or from running to reading and the different types of operations that are required in one case versus the other, but also a shift in the neural circuits that underlie your perception of time. And again, this is a topic that deserves a much more elaborate discussion, but so much of our ability to execute a task with high proficiency has to do with getting our thinking and our actions into the correct time domain. Now, when I say time domain, I know a number of people can get confused because time is time, right? People are like, what do you mean by time domain? Space domain makes sense. Here, I'm not talking about outer space, whether or not you're looking in one location or another, close to your body or far away from your body, or different domains of space. But the time domain is a little trickier for most people to understand. So just think of it this way. When you see a slow motion movie, what you're seeing is a movie that was shot at a high frame rate, many frames per second. Okay, the typical smartphone shoots movies at about 60 frames per second, some older ones 30 frames per second. The slow-mo function on your smartphone is actually a high frame rate function. You took the same movie, but you took it at higher frame rate, so you got a lot more images. Therefore, you can generate slow motion. So with your visual system, when you focus very close in to your body, or you're focused on bodily sensations in your immediate environment, you are fine slicing in the time domain more so than when you are looking further off in the distance. Similarly, when you engage in one type of task, like a board meeting or a Zoom meeting or a conversation with friends, you are in a very different set of neural circuit functions than when you sit down to read or learn math or lift weights or go to therapy or go for a walk with your dog, for instance. Now it should be clear why when you move from task A to task B, you want to A, introduce a transition period. It can be very brief. Maybe you don't even have time for the 2-minute transition period. You just say, okay, I'm in a transition period between task A and task B. I'm moving from this thing to that thing. I just need like 10 seconds. I'm going to recognize, I'm going to count down 10 to 1 or 1 up to 10, doesn't matter. This is transition time. But this is not a time to look at my phone or to be in lots of different time domains. Now, you might say, well, does that mean I shouldn't look at the horizon while I'm walking from my meeting back to my desk? No. That's not the way that your brain works. It doesn't anchor to things that just happen to be in your environment unless they're of particular interest. What I'm saying is set a transition period between tasks, ideally 2, maybe as long as 10 minutes. I'm also saying that when you switch between tasks or when you initiate your first major task of the day, please do expect a period in which it's hard to get into the groove, so to speak. And in addition to that, I recommend having some sort of practice, and I describe the practice that I've used for some period of time now, at least for me, to great success, where you are deliberately shifting your visual attention between different locations close to you and far away. And you're doing that as a perceptual practice. Again, the whole thing only takes about 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes. And you don't even need to do it every day. I happen to do it every day, but I miss the occasional day here and there. And even if you were to do this perceptual practice once a week, or 3 times a week, I'm certain that you'll benefit, because in doing that perceptual practice, there's also an immediate recognition of the sorts of shifts that your brain is required to engage in anytime you move from task A to task B, or from task B to task C. And you start to see and feel, literally see and feel, the way that that transition occurs, and that it takes a little bit of time, but that you can accelerate that transition if you understand that, oh, when I'm looking here and engaging in this type of behavior or sets of tasks, and then I'm now going to be expected to do another task in a completely different type of environment, that the brain is going to be required to shift over the neural circuits that are active and less active in order to do that, but that you can accelerate that process by practicing it using that perceptual tool that I described. So there I covered some specific tools that one can use to enhance one's ability to task switch, touching on a bit of the underlying neurobiology and why transition